Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online developmental psychology course. Today we're talking about emotions, attachment, and social relationships. Before we get into it, just a friendly reminder that the project and everything that's associated with it, deadline is coming up soon. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Alright, so let's jump into this chapter. Izzard and colleagues describe basic emotions. What they did to describe these basic emotions, or come to the understanding of them, was to ask independent raters to describe an infant's emotions. Izzard believed that these basic emotions are biologically based, they develop early in life, and they play a critical role in motivating and organizing behavior. Primary emotions are distinct basic emotions that emerge within the first 6 months of life. Birth. Babies show contentment, smiling, interest, staring, distress, grimacing. Within the 6 months, 6 basic primary emotions evolve from these 3. So basically the idea here is that there's these 3 primary emotions that emerge very on in the developmental process of infants, and these are proposed to be kind of biologically based, and they serve a critical role such as motivating and organizing behavior within children. And what these researchers did, as stated, was kind of just show photos or just watch or movies of children making faces, and then ask various participants to rate or describe, I should say, the infant's faces. And based on that set of analysis conducted over time across many participants, the researchers found kind of a similarity, a high degree of similarity in participants rating these infants' faces, which suggests that there's kind of this universal process of emotions that exist within humans, and thus are biologically based, and thus these primary emotions. And as stated, out of those 3 primary emotions, 6 specific primary emotions grow out of those original kind of 3 emotions, which is contentment, interest, and distress. Next, we have the secondary emotions / self-conscious emotions. After 18 months, self-conscious / secondary emotions emerge. Researchers argue that they require self-awareness. The age when infants recognize themselves in the mirror, that is in the US, and use words like I and me. Embarrassment, sing / dance for relatives, pride, shame, guilt. Some researchers argue that the primary emotions are only action patterns rather than true emotions until children develop self-consciousness and can have thoughts such as, I'm scared of the dog. So kind of the idea here is, kind of by the title, secondary emotions, they require longer, their emergence and development occurs a little later on, at approximately 18 months here. And the argument here is that they require self-consciousness, as I stated, and this self-consciousness allows a child to recognize themselves and thus kind of feel embarrassed. So they understand their action, and then they understand kind of how other people are reacting to their action. Therefore, they can feel embarrassment, shame, pride, etc. However, these specific emotions are debated. That is, the degree to which they are secondary emotions. Some people argue that they're more than the 6 basic emotions, such as pride. Some people argue that pride is the basic emotions, but that's neither here nor there in this for the purpose of this class. And the mirror point is basically alluding to the fact that in individualistic cultures, children tend to recognize themselves in the mirror at faster rates. So kind of there's originally, like all research thought that children recognize themselves in the mirror at a similar age, and not doing so suggests some kind of developmental delay. But later research found that this is not necessarily the case, and in many collectivist cultures, infants do not recognize themselves in the mirror as quickly as American children do. I also want to touch on one other study from Ekman and colleagues in 1971, who explored the similarity of people's emotion expressions in 5 different countries: in the US, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Japan. They showed participants a photograph of a person making one of 6 emotional expressions: happiness, disgust, surprise, sadness, anger, or fear. much similarity across industrialized countries, all showing high degrees of agreement on matches between facial expressions and emotion terms. Accuracy of 80 to 90% for most of the photos. So this kind of suggests, at least in an industrialized setting, that there's this universal process of recognizing emotions. And you can see the various recognizing facial emotions percent accuracy in the table to the right. And you can see that there are some differences in the countries, but more or less all of them approach greater than 70% accuracy. And you can see that happiness is the highest, and it's pretty much thought of by research pretty universally that there's really no culture that express happiness through frowning, at least to my knowledge and the research that I'm familiar with and kind of typically thought of. Thus, you would expect to see higher rates of recognizing facial expressions, specifically happiness, across cultures. To rule out the possibility of shared cultural learning, Ekman and colleagues also examined an isolated culture, the Fore of New Guinea, which had minimal exposure to Western culture. The 4 participants in New Guinea were asked to show expressions while imagining a number of events happening to them. Their expressions were those that people from other cultures would also associate with each scenario, despite the fact that this culture had almost no contact with Western cultures. These findings were taken as strong evidence that certain facial expressions are universal. So kind of the idea here is that the participants in this study were asked to express emotions through facial reactions while imagining a number of specific events happening to them. And then, so whatever, imagine yourself happy or doing something happy. They smile, and obviously smiling is just, that's very similar for Americans in other industrialized countries, as we previously saw. So this evidence suggests, again, kind of this universal evidence for the universality of certain facial expressions. Emotion recognition. Emotional expressions may be universal, but cultural variability still exists in the accuracy of emotional recognition. English speakers were more accurate than Spanish and Japanese speakers at identifying facial expressions posed by Americans. All these groups were more accurate than pre-literate societies, that is, the Fore and Dani from New Guinea. On average, people are 58% accurate in correctly identifying emotional expressions. But when looking at emotional expressions from one's own cultural group, they are about 9% more accurate. People's brains show a greater fear response when seeing the fear expression on the face of someone from the same culture than on the face of someone from another culture. Facial expressions also vary culturally enough that people can reliably guess the nationality of someone from looking at their facial expressions. Even people from similar cultural backgrounds, such as Americans versus Australians, or Japanese versus Japanese Americans, can be distinguished based on their facial expressions. So kind of the idea here is that although Ekman conducted that study to rule out possible cultural learning with the 4 people of New Guinea, wherein they were asked to kind of imagine being happy and then smiling, thus kind of giving similar emotional expressions as other industrialized countries, there is still cultural variability in the accuracy of emotion recognitions across societies, but especially for pre-literate societies, wherein English speakers were more accurate than Spanish and Japanese speakers at identifying facial expressions posed by Americans. So kind of the idea here is that other industrialized societies being more accurate at judging or correctly identifying the facial expressions of other industrialized people compared to individuals living in pre-literate societies or non-industrialized societies, which kind of suggest some kind of shared cultural learning that occurs within industrialized societies and societies that are not pre-literate. And some studies have found that there are neurological activities in brain patterns of brain activation associated with viewing someone from your own culture expressing fear response and the or I should say, compared to someone not in your out group. So kind of the idea here is that seeing someone in your in group, or your nationality, expressing some kind of emotion, in this case fear, being associated with higher activations in brain regions / systems that are associated with fear response. Thus, kind of giving the idea here that you are better at, I should say, compared to seeing someone in fear from your out group. And kind of the idea here is that you're able to better recognize that person's fear is expressing fear, and thus, or someone in your in group is expressing fear by their facial expressions. Thus, you're like, oh damn, something is fearful, something is causing fear in that person. Therefore, maybe I'm in danger. Therefore, I'm going to this now. My recognition that person's scared and I should be scared is going to be reflected in kind of my neurological activity. Is kind of the idea here. Display rules are culturally specific rules governing which facial expressions are appropriate in a situation and how intensely they should be shown. Some cultures indicate that people must express emotions very intensely, whereas others dictate that people should refrain from strongly expressing emotions. The Kaluli of New Guinea show emotions intensely and dramatically. Utku Inuits strongly condemn public expressions of anger. The Balinese, which are a Southeast Asian ethnic group, prefer emotional smoothness and avoid strong displays of emotion, either positive or negative. People from collectivist cultures such as Japan tend to mask or restrain their emotional expressions. People from collectivist cultures tend to conceal their emotional expressions by presenting a more neutral or pleasant face. This affects where on the face one attends when deciphering another person's emotional state. Because muscles around the eyes are harder to control than muscles around the mouth, Japanese are more likely than Americans to attend to the eyes. Americans are more likely than Japanese to attend to the mouth because it is a greater source of information than the eyes. So as stated, cultures differ, and the types of emotion and the intensity of emotions how much intensity should be expressed. The intensity of your emotions should be expressed, I should say. And conversely, how much restraint should an individual use when expressing emotions, with varying cultures as details having different display rules, where some display rules call for a more intense expression, and some calling for more restraint and public expressions and intensive public expressions of anger, for example, being not a cultural norm and looked down upon within particular cultures. And you can see cultural difference kind of on a broad span when comparing collectivist versus individualistic cultures, with collectivist cultures being more likely to refrain or mask their emotional expressions. And this is kind of just thinking through basic tenets of collectivism, kind of the idea here that my well-being and kind of the well-being of the group is what is important. So therefore, kind of you don't want to express kind of outrage or be super expressive or intense with your emotions, thus kind of disturbing the group harmony, because that can be negative to myself and kind of our group survival. Thus, as stated, collectivist cultures tend to mask or restrain their emotional expressions, and this can actually be measured in eye tracking data. So basically, you hook up a machine to an individual, which tracks literally where they're looking, and so you can hook up groups of individuals or an individual from different groups to an eye tracking machine, and then look at track, I should say, where a participant is looking on a face. And what researchers find is that Japanese individuals tend more to the eyes, and that is because, as stated, collectivist cultures, and Japan specifically in this study, tends to mask or restrain their emotional expressions. and the eye muscles are more difficult to kind of restrain. Thus, they give a little more cue they give a valuable cue to another individual's emotional state. Whereas Americans will look less at the eyes because they're in general have a much more expressive face, so you don't have to kind of attune to these kind of micro details in the eye. Display rules also lead to ritualized displays, which are culturally idiosyncratic facial expressions that are not recognized universally. An example is embarrassment, which has both a universal expression and culturally specific expressions. The one on the left of the slide is generally recognized to be an expression of embarrassment, and the image on the right side is recognized by people in some Asian countries to be an expression of embarrassment. So again, kind of evidence for the universality of some emotions. However, display rules and kind of the expression of some of these kind of quote-unquote basic emotions differ across cultures. Again, which provides evidence of cultural variability in cultural learning and the expression of emotions. Different display rules can be seen in independent versus interdependent cultures. Cultural differences in emotional intensity. Americans report feeling emotions longer and more intensely than Japanese. Ghanaians attend less to their emotions than Americans. People from interdependent cultures may also respond to anger-provoking events differently than people from independent cultures. One study examined how people from two cultural backgrounds responded to scenarios that typically provoke anger. The results showed that Chinese Canadians found scenarios in the relatively less anger-provoking than white Canadians, and white Canadians' most common response to the anger-provoking event was to openly express their anger, while Chinese Canadians tried to adopt strategies to minimize the anger response and then felt less angry. Compared to independent cultures, people from interdependent cultures perceive it to be more socially damaging and inappropriate to express anger. Could have negative implications for group harmony. In such cultures, people may have learned to experience anger less intensely and develop strategies to effectively minimize anger. I had a student actually recently ask me about kind of the health outcomes associated with expressing emotion. And here is kind of one example of that, wherein Americans are typically taught that you should express your emotions. And this is reflected in cultural practices of expressing emotions longer compared to other cultures, such as Japanese individuals, as well as attending to their emotions. Studies have found that Ghanaians attend less to their emotion than Americans. But not only do they attend less to their emotions or experience emotions more intensely, they also, Americans, I should say, experience emotions longer. And this could be reflected in kind of these values, I should say, of cultural display rules as reflected of individualistic and independent cultures versus independent and collectivist cultures contribute to particular cultural practices wherein cultures that are interdependent or collectivist develop strategies to experience less initial anger and or minimize anger over time. That is, return kind of to a baseline. So after experiencing angers, returning back to kind of a state of kind of equilibrium or calmness in general. So kind of not only just that possible initial spike in anger being more intense for Americans, but the duration of anger and expression of anger longer in Americans and kind of individualistic cultures compared to interdependent cultures. And one study I wanted to point out was a study on the physiological responses to anger-provoking events. Chinese Canadian and white Canadian participants were exposed to a rude, unprofessional experimenter in the lab. Both cultural groups reported initially feeling angry. Blood pressure of Chinese Canadians, which rose in response to the anger-provoking event, returned to baseline much more quickly than the blood pressure of white Canadians in the same situation. This is physiological evidence of a faster dissipation of anger among the Chinese Canadians. Findings suggest that Chinese Canadians may be more comfortable with suppressing anger, whereas white Canadians may have more negative physiological effects from not openly expressing their anger. So in this example, we see kind of an initial response as to anger, and that is kind of a blood pressure response, I should say. But over time, the blood pressure, white Canadian blood pressure compared to Chinese Canadian blood pressures is more elevated across time. And this could, again, go back to cultural differences in these values, these display rules, and kind of the values associated with them, generating and being reflected in particular cultural practices that contribute to quicker anger suppression. And not only that, but specific health outcomes associated with suppression of emotions, wherein interdependent cultures do not, or many interdependent cultures are less likely, and many studies find have no kind of mental health or physical health outcomes or negative outcomes associated with that suppression, compared to Americans, who often do have those negative outcomes associated with emotional expression. And again, kind of providing evidence of differences of display roles in cultural values and their repercussions associated with kind of violating those display roles, or just kind of expressing emotion more in general. In emotions and agings, emotions are not less important in older adults. In fact, older adults experience emotions with similar intensity as younger adults, at least in the United States. Older adults seem to live more positive emotional lives. And two suspected reasons for that in the U.S. is that they are better at emotional regulation, especially at achieving their main goal of maximizing positive emotions and minimizing negative ones. At times, older adults become emotionally overwhelmed by stressful life events. So kind of the idea here is that, and we'll touch on this momentarily, is that older adults experience emotion intensity at similar levels as younger adults in the U.S. And there are kind of a couple of different reasons, thoughts to kind of underlie this, and that is that they're better at emotional regulations, and they have a goal of just maximizing positive experience and minimizing negative ones. However, despite kind of this goal and suspected better emotional regulation, older adults obviously can still be overwhelmed and have negative effects associated with prolonged, intense, and stressful life events. Next, the social emotional selectivity theory. Older adults perceive that one has little time left to live, and that prompts more emphasis on the goal of fulfilling current emotional needs. Positivity effect. Tendency for older adults to pay attention to, better remember, and place more priority on positive information than on negative information. Research suggests that brain areas involved in emotion, such as the amygdala and the ventral medial area of the prefrontal cortex, degenerate less with age than other brain areas involved in cognition. So kind of the idea here is that this is kind of a theory associated why older adults may have kind of a positivity bias, and that's their emphasis, as stated in the previous slide, on fulfilling their current emotional needs. They feel like they have less time to live. And this kind of creates this positivity effect wherein they attend to and remember more positive information at higher rates than negative information. And some researchers argue that this is reflected in the fact that brain areas involved in emotions degenerate less with age than other brain areas involved in cognition. So kind of the idea here is because these emotional areas of the brain that are associated with processing emotion deteriorate at slower rates than other areas of the brain. This allows for kind of emotional processing of emotional information to remain at consistent levels across the lifespan. So therefore, theoretically, whatever, if the amygdala was destroyed at 70 years old or something along those lines, older adults would be less likely or less able to process positive emotion, and therefore less likely or less able to kind of experience happiness because because areas of your brain implicated in emotional processing are damaged, in this hypothetical scenario. Overall, emotional well-being increases with age, at least in the U.S. Older adults also experience longer lasting positive emotions, fleeting negative emotions, and fewer emotional ups and downs per day. So kind of just a longer lasting positive emotions and kind of more stability overall, research suggests. However, happiness seems to be central to many people from Western cultures. Some date this pursuit of happiness in the West as beginning in the Enlightenment of the 18th century. The West viewed the world as more predictable as opposed to associating happiness with luck. Cultures that still associate happiness with luck tend to be less happy in general. Moreover, over time, becoming happy has turned into an individual endeavor. Across 30 countries, luck was part of the definition of happiness for all except the United States, Spain, Argentina, Ecuador, India, and Kenya. So kind of the idea here is that you can imagine a 16th century Europe, for example, or much of the world being a place of mass plagues, starvation, obviously less technological advancement, and healthy developmental outcomes. And thus, kind of the idea that you're not born into nobility or wealth is kind of more thrown into your face because, and kind of the sheer luck associated with it, because you're either born wealthy or you're not, and everybody else is kind of you're a serf or you're a noble or some other more wealthy person. However, kind of with the Western culture entered kind of the Age of Enlightenment, and kind of industrialization accompanied it. The idea was, okay, now we can kind of act on the world. We can create these inventions. We now kind of control, quote unquote, control our destiny. We're acting on the earth. We're creating riches ourselves through our own individual pursuits of kind of within a marketplace. Is at the same time as like capitalism is emerging. Thus, luck is seen less kind of associated with happiness because you're able to theoretically generate wealth through your own work, and the world just overall is more predictable due to kind of to technological advancements. And in general, however, across the world, luck is generally associated or is kind of when people talk about and describe happiness in general, luck is still a part of that in the supermajority of countries, aside from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever that is, 2, 4, 6 countries out of 30. So approximately about 80% basically of countries in this study still associated happiness with luck. And you can numerous reasons why. If you're born into a low-income post-colonial country, or a country being bombed, or a country that's you're from an island state that's going to get possibly disappear due to climate change, that is not a decision that you made. You're just born in those circumstances. So thus, luck is going to be associated with happiness kind of throughout the majority of the world. Happiness is generally studied using the construct of subjective well-being, which is the feeling of being satisfied with one's life. There are substantial cultural differences in terms of the average levels of subjective well-being that people report. Northern Europeans, such as Scandinavian, Nordic, or Latin American countries, typically top the list, along with other English-speaking countries in Western Europe. Cultural differences in subjective well-being can be affected by several factors: income level or wealth, but only up to a certain point. Once the country has a GDP that is about 40% of that of the United States, wealth no longer predicts subjective well-being, according to, this is from a particular study that I'm citing. Access to, a collection of studies. Access to enough wealth to easily meet basic needs of life tends to yield considerably more satisfaction with life. The correlation between income and well-being seems strongest at very low levels, probably because a little more money at that level can make a very big difference in survival and the quality of life. As found in the slums of Kolkata, which recently, semi-recently changed its name, but it's slums in West Bengal. In industrialized nations, the correlation is weaker but still positive. Protection of human rights and equality. Countries with greater recognition of human rights tend to be happier. May explain why there are countries with low income and human rights but still report high well-being in countries with high income and human rights that have lower levels of well-being than you might expect. All right, so basically what we have here is that well-being is associated with kind of GDP, or just kind of income and wealth within a country, and kind of the up to a certain point. And this is kind of straightforward. If you don't have enough money to not starve to death, not live outside, or meet basic needs, and then having the money to meet basic needs, you're going to experience kind of an uptick in your overall well-being. However, there are countries with low income and low human rights that still report high well-being, and countries with high income and high rights that have lower levels of well-being than you might predict. So basically, there's a model that would predict, based on a country's human rights record and income record, what their overall well-being, and this can be for a whole host of reasons, one of which human rights being described in the West as there's particular notions of human rights within the West. Traditionally, rights I should say rights that kind of revolve around the individual, so kind of like individual liberty, versus in other countries that may express human rights through economic rights, so the right to whatever house, or right to health care, or some level of equality. That we talked about that in the previous chapter, with distributing funds, Indians and collectivist cultures kind of in general being distributing resources in more kind of equal, or based on the principle of equality or need, at higher rates than individualistic cultures. So that could be driving differences, or kind of driving the unexpected findings according to this research, or at least contributing to it. So like theoretically, a country who has some kind of high economic rights, and that culture defines that as human rights, but is still like kind of relatively a low income country, but are able to meet kind of basic or satisfy basic needs, could have a country that would rate their populace rating themselves as having higher levels of well-being than would be predicted based on kind of this model of income and human rights driving happiness. Cultural differences in subjective well-being can also be explained by cultural differences in the way people define life satisfaction. Individualistic cultures tend to base life satisfaction on how many positive emotions they are experiencing. Collectivist cultures tend to base life satisfaction on how much they were being respected for living up to the cultural norms and other standards for being a good person. So kind of just the idea here is that different cultures may just have kind of different definitions, or at least use different metrics of subjective well-being, wherein individualist cultures base their life satisfaction on how much positivity they experience, versus a collectivist cultures basing their life satisfaction on living up to cultural norms. Thus, if you're asking questions that primarily deal with how happy are you individually experiencing today, collectivist cultures may report that they're feeling less happy, but however, that's just not a kind of an accurate or valid measure of happiness within that cultural context. Moving on to attachment theory. It's based primarily on ethology, the study of the behavior of various species in the natural environment and the evolution of that behavior. Asks how attachment might have helped our ancestors adapt to their environment. Attachment is a strong affectional tie that binds a person to an intimate companion, a behavioral system through which humans regulate their emotional distress when under threat and achieve security by seeking proximity to another person. For most babies, the first attachment is apparent at 6 to 7 months of age. Throughout our life, objects of our attachment are special, irreplaceable people to whom we want to be close and from whom we derive a sense of security. So kind of the idea here, and we'll talk about more of this momentarily, is that you have this kind of biological need where humans and this biological need and kind of the elongated development of humans requires kind of this attachment wherein infants form strong emotional bonds to their parents or caregiver, but kind of traditionally the studies have looked at parents, but subsequent studies have found kind of caregivers in other findings, but whatever. So traditionally it's thought of as parents, and which protects them, but also kind of acts as this safe haven, which we'll get into later, wherein if an infant is feeling endangered or need to regulate kind of their emotional response to something, they can go to kind of a steady individual who they know is safe, trustworthy, and can help regulate their behaviors and their emotional response to being fearful, for example. Attachment theorists argue that infants and parents are biologically predisposed to form attachments because they contribute to survival. Imprinting, seen in some bird species, are an innate form of learning in which the young will follow and become attached to a moving object. Babies' behaviors ensure adults will love them and meet their needs, such as sucking, smiling, cooing, and crying. The hypothalamus prepares parents for caregiving by releasing oxytocin. So imprinting is kind of a different species form of kind of attachment, but that's really an automatic process. That is an innate form of learning, so whatever they like, kind of the classic thing of a duck looking at an individual for the first time and then just following that person around until they're of adult duck age. And then kind of the idea here is that babies' behaviors also kind of behaviorally contribute to that attachment between parents or caregiver and the child through cooing, smiling, crying, etc. And also at a biological level, the hypothalamus of parents releases oxytocin, which are kind of like these emotional intensifiers, which will increase the likelihood of that emotional connection forming between parents and their children. All of which suggesting that this attachment is a kind of a species-specific necessity needed for young children who are extremely vulnerable to survive. So it's an evolutionary benefit for young humans to, or newborn infants, I should say, to basically develop innately or kind of be predisposed to form or develop with their caregiver because it's so important to their survival and theoretically the survival of the species. Attachments, however, in humans do not form automatically. A responsive social environment is critical. An infant's pre-programmed signals to other people may eventually wane if caregivers are unresponsive to them. Infants construct expectations about relationships via internal working models. They are cognitive representations of themselves and other people. They guide processing of social information and behavior in relationships. Studies suggest securely attached infants will develop secure internal working models that they are lovable in most U.S. samples. Insecurely attached develop models that they are difficult to love. So the idea here is that unlike the duck, which has that innate kind of automatic attachment to the first person they see, here for humans, if they develop in an environment that is not responsive to them, they will have negative repercussions associated with their kind of attachment style. And kind of one repercussion or one proposed repercussion is that they develop this internal representation of themselves or this working model of their themselves within relationships, specifically between their caregiver and themselves, but kind of that working model could be applied to future social relationships. So insecure attachment individuals kind of so an unresponsive environment contributing to an insecure attachment, which kind of leads to this conclusion that within that child, over time, that they are difficult to love. And we'll get into specific attachment styles momentarily. Skipping ahead slightly to caregivers' attachment to infants. Bonding is distinguished from attachment, a more biologically based process in which parent and infant form a connection through contact in the first hours after birth when both are highly alert. Caregivers and infants develop synchronized routines, harmonious dance-like interactions between infant and caregiver in which each adjusts behavior in response to that of the other. So the idea here, and if you remember from previous slide, attachment does, or theoretically, it's argued that attachment is, the first real attachment begins at approximately 6 to 7 months of age. But prior to that, there still is kind of this bonding that is going on, just using this term, wherein it's more of this biological process where you form kind of this instant connection with the child through almost immediately upon birth. And as previously stated with attachment, it's not this automatic process, but rather developmental outcomes associated with attachment and the specific type of attachment that develops is in response to particular environments. Well, here this bonding is kind of this more of this immediate, automatic, almost more like that duck-like innate process, wherein a form of connection is formed between a form of connection is kind of present, I should say, between parents and their children almost immediately. And through those kind of early days and months of working together, caregivers and infants kind of respond to each other and adjust their behavior in response to each other's behavior. And as stated, bonding occurring almost immediately, but in general there are thought to be 4 phases of development of attachment. The first, undiscriminating social responsiveness, 2 to 3 months. Responsive to voices, faces, but any human interests them. Discriminating social responsiveness, 2 to 3 months, or 6 to 7 months. Begin to show preferences for familiar companions. Direct biggest grins and babbles towards companions, still friendly with strangers. True attachment, 6 to 7 months to 3 years. First real attachments. Infants follow mother, protest when she leaves, greet warmly when she returns. Infants become attached to fathers, siblings, grandparents, babysitters as well. Goal-directed partnership, 3 years and older, taking a parent's goals and plans into consideration and adjusting the behavior accordingly. Understanding that when a parent leaves for work, they will come back and know where to wait for them. So kind of the idea here is that through time we go from attachment, wherein any emotional response and face from any human kind of satisfies an interest of the child, to over time showing preferential responses to their companions and kind of their parents, in general, or extended family, and more so than strangers. And then finally, kind of the quote unquote real attachment, wherein infants will follow their person who they're attached to around, cry when that person leaves, and then greet them warmly when they return. And then over time, infants develop kind of more an individualized understanding of their parent. That person is an individual. They're going to leave. They're going to come back, and it's they're not disappearing forever. The infant is more able to recognize, kind of through the development of if you remember social cognition, that their caregivers, their parents, have their own plans and kind of life, and thus they should adjust their behavior kind of in response to the goals and motivations and plans of their parents. Exploratory behavior. The formation of a strong attachment has the positive effect of facilitating exploratory behavior. Secure base, a point of safety from which an infant can feel to venture, and a safe haven an infant can return to for comfort if frightened. So kind of the idea here is that an infant knows that there is a caregiver, someone that they're attached to in the room or exist, and therefore they can explore. So they can explore and interact with the world if something and leave, from a secure base. So they have like their base, and then from there, whatever you can imagine, like a base, like an army or something. And then from there, you can scout ahead, learn, or whatever. However, also if something scares you, something's overwhelming to the infant, they know that they can return back to their strong attachment, their caregiver, and be comforted in in response to being overwhelmed in their exploratory behavior. So it facilitates exploratory behavior because this buffering effect, this protective, strong attachment protects the child, physically, but also kind of from being emotionally overwhelmed. So they can explore the world, develop, and also have someone to protect them from any being overwhelmed in this kind of exploratory process. Quality of attachment, Ainsworth-Strain situation. Laboratory procedure designed to evaluate attachment style by observing 1-year-olds' reactions to being separated from and then reunited with their primary caregivers. Start out by placing the infant and mother in an unfamiliar room loaded with all kinds of interesting toys the infant is free to explore. The researchers observe how comfortable the infant is exploring on his or her own, the infant's emotional reaction when a stranger enters the room, the infant's response to the mother leaving the infant alone with the stranger, and infant's behavior when the mother returns. Based on the infant's behavior in these stages of the strain situation, researchers classify infants' attachment relationships into one of 4 categories. So this is a classic study. So basically you put, as I stated, put a parent or a caregiver in a room that they're unfamiliar with a bunch of toys. You see, and researchers basically rate based on these scales that they have, their exploratory behavior, how they're just through a number of subscales, rate the infant and parents' kind of interactions and their behavior within the room. Then the parent leaves the room, and then a stranger will enter the room, and then the stranger will leave the room, and then the mother will re-enter the room. So basically we have kind of this period of play, mother leaving the room, infant stressed. Either some many versions of this study then have someone else enter the room, someone they're unfamiliar with, and kind of interact with the child very briefly, then leave, and then the parent comes back in, and then researchers will again kind of classify the infant's behavior, and based on that behavior they observed, they will then classify the child into one of 4 attachment styles: secure attachment, resistant attachment, avoidant attachment, or disoriented attachment. Secure attachment being kind of an intimate relationship in which the individual welcomes close contact, uses the attachment object as a source of comfort and dislikes, but can manage separations. Resistant is also referred to as insecure infant. The caregiver bond or other intimate relationships characterized by strong separation anxiety and a tendency to show ambivalent reactions to the attachment. Upon reunion, seeking and yet resisting contact and not being comforted. Avoidant, an insecure infant caregiver bond or other intimate relationship characterized by little separation anxiety and a tendency to avoid or ignore the detachment object upon return. Disorganized, disoriented attachment. This is an insecure infant caregiver bond common among abused children. This combined features of the resistance and the abused attachment styles and is characterized by the infant's dazed response to reunion and confusion about whether to approach or avoid the caregiver. So we kind of have a secure attachment, which is like the classic, like they have a warm relationship. The infant can get distressed, but upon when their mother or caregiver leaves, or whoever they're attached to leaves, but once the caregiver comes back, they welcome the child welcomes the caregiver back. Versus kind of resistance, wherein upon like reunion with the attached figure, they are typically extremely upset. They have separation, and they have kind of separation anxiety. Avoidant is kind of more straightforward. Upon reunion, they'll avoid the person, the caregiver that they have an attachment to. And the disoriented is kind of like this mismatch of kind of both resistant and avoidant, where the child is confused. The child doesn't know if they should avoid or kind of just cry and to kind of suffer the repercussions of separation anxiety. So it's really kind of this confused approach wherein it's kind of just the child is haphazardly using character or like techniques associated with resistance and avoided. Thus, it's disoriented, it's disorganized attachment. And those percentages are reflective of kind of like classic US samples in kind of Western European. Cultural and social context and attachment. Northern Germany, the most common attachment style was avoidant attachment, and this was viewed as the ideal. Northern German mothers associate avoidance with signs of early independence, a culturally valued trait. The Israeli kibbutz set up a system of communal child care to free the adults to spend more time doing economically productive work. Children raised in the most traditional form of the kibbutz, starting at 3 months, spent their entire days and nights, with the exception of a 3-hour dinner break with their parents, in a communal environment with a caregiver and several other children their age. The most common form of attachment in kibbutz-reared infants was anxious ambivalent. Some studies have found no avoidant attachment in Japanese samples and among the Dogon in West Africa, where infants are in constant proximity to their parents. So kind of the idea here is that although kind of traditional studies have found that secure attachment is associated with the most optimal, the best developmental outcomes, this is not consistent across cultures. And also, not only that, but the 4 classifications of how you rate the quality of parent-child attachment is not found across all cultures, and this could be due to different cultures having different proximities to their parents. So specifically in this Dogon example in West Africa, with the child constantly in close proximity to the child or to the parents, this can contribute to, in this developmental context, contributing to the non-existence of avoidant attachments in this developmental context. So again, certain developmental contexts require and promote particular cultural values, wherein particular types of attachments are more not just approved more by society, but are associated with different positive outcomes or sets of different outcomes across cultures, just like how we saw with the kind of ability or the willingness to express anger in those previous studies being associated with different developmental outcomes. And this is kind of the similar case here. Moving back to Western European context, implications for early attachment. Studies of institutionalized Romanian children adopted by American, UK, and Canadian families. Those who were adopted before 1 year of age have a good chance of becoming as securely attached to their caregivers after 1 year, high rates of insecure and disturbed attachment. And this is a very famous study. You can Google this. There are dozens of articles about this with different developmental outcomes and following these children through development. And basically the idea here is that once there's kind of a theory, well, there's different theories here, but there's kind of a dosage effect. So we're in kind of the accumulation of trauma from not having an attachment to a child. Once you hit a X amount of time, in this case, in this sample of children, it's generally around 1 year of age, where children who are adopted by families prior to that 1 year of age kind of see kind of classic developmental trajectories. But children who are developed later, that accumulation of stress from being in these orphanages, these institutions, where there's basically a lot of deprivation, that accumulation over time kind of hits a tipping point at 1 year old, where you start to see differences in developmental trajectory of numerous physical, mental, and kind of health outcomes and developmental outcomes just in general associated with being in this institutionalized institution, I should say, of orphans past 1 year of age, which suggests kind of a sensitive period of attachment development. The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development study of early child care found that infants who received routine care by someone other than their mothers were no less securely attached to their mothers. Quality of parenting was a much stronger influence on infant attachment and development than daycare experience, and quality of daycare matters Children are likely to thrive when they interact with sensitive and stimulating parents and caregivers. So, kind of the idea here is just looking at the impact of daycares on attachments. And basically, what this large study found, is that infants who receive routine care from other people than their mothers are not less securely attached to their mothers, and this makes sense given other cross-cultural studies that we just covered, wherein often entire communities are raising a child rather than in this case a mother, or just kind of a mother and father, or just parents in general. And the kind of the idea here is that the quality of the daycare matters. So children develop optimally when they interact with sensitive and stimulating caregivers and parents, or kind of extended family in general. So kind of straightforward here. Jumping ahead to parent-child attachments in childhood. At age 3, children grow more independent of the parent, want separations to be predictable and controllable, and obviously this is culturally based. This is more associated with individualistic cultures. Attachment becomes a goal-corrected partnership in which parents and child accommodate to each other's needs. Children continue to seek attention and approval from their parents, and they look more to peers for social and emotional support. The idea here is that, as stated, with age, children's kind of social cognition develops. They recognize the caregivers have their own goals, and thus parents and children accommodate each other to meet each other's basic needs. And children are still reliant and seek approval and attention from their parents, but also they now also look for attention or approval from, I should say, social and emotional support from their peers. Peer networks. 10% of social interactions in toddlerhood are with peers. 30% of those in middle childhood are with peers. Children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo spend more time with older children and less with age mates than children in two U.S. cities. So kind of the idea here is that with time you have more peer interaction. You spend less time talking to your parents, you go to school, thus you're talking more with peers, your teachers, and just other children in general. Thus you see larger increases in social interaction with peers as children age. But however, there are cultural differences, and the age of peers that children interact with children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, spending more time with older children than American children. So kind of those classic dynamics of, you don't want to mix certain children of particular ages together. That is not cross-culturally seen, or that at least that theory and that kind of cultural practice is not cross-culturally adhered to. And this is the collective nature of countries such as the DRC, wherein children are expected kind of to take on more parenting role and contribute to parenting overall, could kind of contribute to this younger children interacting with older children at higher rates than in at least 2 cities found in the United States, but kind of the United States in general. As children age, they spend much more time playing. Locomotor play, such as tag, object play, such as stacking blocks, social play, such as board games, and pretend play, enacting roles. 2 changes in play between infancy and age 5. The play becomes more social and more imaginative. Parton's categories of preschool play in order from least to most social, and as stated, play becomes more social with age, beginning with solitary play. Children play alone, typically with objects, and appear to be highly involved in what they are doing. Parallel play. Children play next to one another, doing much the same thing, but they interact very little. 2 girls might sit next to each other, both drawing pictures without talking to each other much. Associative play. Children interact by swapping materials, conversing, or following each other's lead, but they are not united by the same goal. 2 girls may swap crayons and comment on each other's drawings as they draw. Cooperative play. Children join forces to achieve a common goal. They act as a pair or group, dividing their labor and coordinating their activities in a meaningful way. 2 girls collaborate to draw a big mural. So it's kind of straightforward here that through time, we go from kind of just playing by yourself to playing next to somebody to kind of interacting with someone to then working on and cooperating with other individuals. Again, reflecting kind of the development of play, becoming more social and becoming more imaginative with age. And as I stated, play becomes more imaginative with age and more structured with age. Beginning with pretend play, play in which one actor, object, or action symbolizes or stands for another. At age 1 is the first pretend play. Play in which one actor, object, or action symbolizes or stands for one or another, as I stated. At ages 2 to 5, pretend play blossoms. Social pretend play. It's universal, but the content of preschool's plays are culturally influenced. At school age, playing organized games with rules. Groups that hang out together have their own norms of behavior, often organized hierarchically, or have a pecking order with leaders and followers. And what good is play? Who cares? Why play? Because play is associated with the development of motor, cognitive, language, social, creativity, executive function, emotional skills. Physical and locomotor play is associated with neuromaturation of corresponding brain regions and the refinement of fine motor skills, and contributes to healthy emotional development, providing opportunities to act out or express bothersome feelings, regulate emotions, and resolve emotional conflicts. So kind of the idea is that with pretend play, this is a very complex phenomenon, and it's associated with a whole host of developmental outcomes, as I stated, and it's quite beneficial to development. So kind of this is, it's important that children have the opportunity to play, to both running around or which in a structured environment, I should say, such as like a sport or whatever, but also kind of just pretend play, because it allows for children to imagine themselves as other people, and also just kind of interact or enact or act out their emotions that they're feeling as another character. And when you pretend with another person, that is kind of a high degree of cognitive difficulty that occurs only with age. And that advancement, that leap in social skills allows and is associated with a whole host of positive developmental outcomes, as I stated. Because children are then able to kind of simulate future world life scenarios in the present and alongside and cooperating with another individual. And obviously, just running around in general is associated with development of muscles, but also neuro regions that are associated with motor movement, such as the motor cortex, being associated with play. So again, play, very important and a critical aspect of development. Continuing on with the impact of peers on development, peer acceptance, social categories. Popular children are well liked by most and rarely disliked. Rejected children, rarely liked and often disliked. Neglected, neither liked nor disliked. These children seem to be invisible to their classmates. Controversial, liked by many, but also disliked by many. And average, in the middle of both the liked and disliked scales. Why are some children more popular than others? Physical attraction seems to play a role, and physically attractive children are more liked. Social competence predicts popularity. Rejected children are often highly aggressive. Some are socially isolated, submissive children. Neglected children have good social skills, but are non-aggressive. They tend to be shy and unassertive. Controversial children have good social skills, leadership qualities, but are also aggressive. And what are the implications of the social categories of peer acceptance? Children who are neglected by peers often gain greater acceptance later, possibly because they often have reasonably good social skills. Poorer outcomes are more likely among extremely socially withdrawn children, children whose social anxiety keeps them from interacting with peers and exposes them to victimization. Children who are rejected due to aggressive behavior are likely to maintain their rejected status from year to year, become more poorly adjusted as a result of being rejected, lose opportunities to learn social skills, and are negatively impacted by other antisocial peers. Stress from being rejected by peers is associated with inflammatory processes which contribute to health developmental outcomes. Training helps kids improve interaction skills and acceptance. So, as I stated, play and peers are very important in development, and thus children, not being able to participate in those play in play and kind of the socialization process are at higher risk of negative developmental outcomes. And just looking specifically at aggressive children, so a child who just maybe getting into fights or just being uncooperative during play, thus their peers kind of reject them. Thus, that child will lose socialization opportunities, so they never have the opportunity to practice socialization, which accumulates over time, contributing to that child becoming more poorly adjusted as a result of that rejection. And what ends up happening is they will end up finding some peers, but those peers will be other antisocial peers, or other, I should say, negative peer or aggressive peers who were rejected as well. And kind of this creates and contributes to, I should say, kind of an antisocial cycle. And you imagine in general, children from these types of children come from unstable households wherein they're not getting receiving proper kind of socialization at home, and maybe have aggressive parents at home. So you kind of create this vicious cycle wherein this initial aggressive behavior becomes exacerbated over time due to the loss of opportunity to practice their social skills as stated, but also reinforced through their peer relationships and their family relationships. And this stress over time is associated with at risk or a higher risk of poor developmental outcomes and health outcomes. However, some training programs have been found that target interaction skills to increase acceptance by peers and increases in kind of social opportunities. Friendships. A study of 7 to 8-year-olds found that 39% of children rejected by peers had at least one mutual or reciprocated friendship. 31% of popular children lacked such a friendship. Having at least one friend increases the odds that a child will be happy and socially competent and reduces the odds that a child will become depressed. Most protective when the friend is well-adjusted and supportive. Teaches how to be emotionally intimate and paves the way for romantic relationships. So kind of the idea here that it's really just not just the raw quantity of friends, but obviously the quality of friends. Wherein kind of having a supportive, socially competent, and well-adjusted friend contributing to positive outcomes and acting as a protective factor for a child who may have been rejected or just may be kind of a little shy and who just needs just through time, or maybe also unassertive, and through time just kind of just needs a little more social experience. And in the presence of this supportive, well-adjusted friendship, they can work on their social skills, develop a little more confidence, but also kind of through that friendship grow to understand emotional intimacy, and these kind of primary first friendships kind of serve as a model and paves the way for future romantic relationships. Attachments to parents and adolescents. Adolescents need the security and encouragement to explore, to become independent and autonomous individuals provided by supportive parents. Obviously, this would have also has a cultural variability. Adolescents would secure parent-child attachments, have a stronger sense of identity, greater social competence, better emotional adjustments, fewer behavioral problems, and form high-quality attachment to friends and later romantic partners than adolescents with insecure attachments to their parents. So the idea here is that these initial attachments kind of serve as foundations and models of future relationships, as I stated early on in the lecture, and in studies have found in the U.S. That secure attachments being associated with greater social competence and better emotional adjustments. But I should even say in the U.S. There is variability in these findings as well, with different ethnic groups or different economic groups having different preferred attachment styles that can contribute to differences in developmental outcome associated with particular types of attachments. So kind of like everything in this class, it's important to kind of know the quote-unquote seminal work, but also be aware that this is the kind of limitations of weird studies. And also consider the fact that not only that these kind of attachments, but these kind of larger networks of individuals, of family, of extended families, and also kind of public policy can contribute to better emotional adjustment and fewer behavioral problems. So if there are more opportunities for counseling or whatever, that was so you can imagine a scenario where there's a public policy for free counseling for all children or something along those lines, or individuals who are come from highly poor neighborhoods where there's more stress in the home and thus harming the attachment in bonding, or well, not as bonding as I said before, but kind of more not in that definitional way, but kind of just the relationship, I should say, between caregivers and children, that kind of stress associated with poverty, then obviously reducing poverty, contributing to kind of higher or at least positive developmental outcomes associated with particular forms of attachment. So again, kind of not only keep in mind cultural variability, but also understanding that these macro systems contribute to these developmental outcomes associated with particular attachment styles. And over time, changes to those particular structures and or public policies could contribute to different developmental outcomes associated with particular types of attachment. Friendships change with age. Adolescents increasingly choose friends whose psychological qualities, such as their interests, attitudes, values, and personalities, match their own. Same-sex friendships are emotionally intimate throughout adolescence, and cross-sex friendships begin in the 11th grade. Early childhood friendships are based around enjoyment of common activities. Late childhood friendships are primarily based around mutual loyalty and caring. In adolescence, friendship is primarily focused on intimacy and self-disclosure, or in disclosure. So kind of like how I stated before with friendships, these same-sex or traditional same-sex friendships kind of have an emotional intimacy to them and kind of serve as a model for future relationships, and obviously serve as a protective factor if that friendship is with someone who is well adjusted. But as we saw with peers who are aggressive and possibly rejected by their friends and in more antisocial groups, this can have a negative impact. But the idea here is that just regardless, those friendships serve kind of as models for future romantic relationships and have emotional intimacy embedded within them. Changing social networks. Dunphy proposed how peer group structures change during adolescence to prepare for dating relationships. Late childhood same-sex groups, there are little interaction with the opposite sex. Girl and boy cliques begin to interact. Same-sex cliques provide a secure base for romantic relationships. In early adolescence, popular boys and girls form mixed-sex cliques. Crowds then form, which are a loose collection of mixed-sex cliques with similar characteristics, provides a vehicle for socializing with the other sex through organized social gatherings such as parties. High school crowds lessen as couples form. So kind of the idea here is that these cliques are forming, same-sex groups of cliques are forming with little interaction between opposite groups, and over time these cliques kind of come together and interact with each other, and those same-sex groups operate kind of as a secure base for romantic relationships. So allowing a boy or a girl to go interact with a romantic interest, and then if it goes well or poorly, that person can come back to their same-sex clique, and that social relationship can serve as kind of a safe harbor, kind of similar to the parent-child relationship in early childhood. And then over time, those same-sex cliques interact with each other as stated, and then this crowd forms where there's just a large kind of collection of mixed-sex cliques, which allow for large social gatherings and then couples to form. And as couples form, crowds dissipate, and people break up into basically couples over time. And that's kind of the proposed model, according to Dunphy. Peer influence. Peers typically do more to foster important social learning and positive behavior than to encourage antisocial behavior. Getting in trouble by conforming to peers is less likely among adolescents who have secure attachment to warm and authoritative parents who are neither too lax nor too strict. So kind of the idea here is that classic example of adolescents interacting with their peers. It's going to be chaos and they're going to have a negative influence. It's traditionally not found. And in general, peers do more to foster positive developmental outcomes than negative positive outcomes. As children age, the percentage of adolescents reporting they have been in a, quote, special romantic relationship increases, going from about 25% at 12 years old to about 70% at 18 years old. Adolescent romantic relationships evolved through 4 proposed phases. The first, initiation, coming to see oneself as a person capable of a romantic relationship. Status, peer approval is what counts. Having the right kind of partner is important for the status it brings in the larger peer group. Affection. This is during late adolescence. The focus on the relationship rather than on self-concept or peer status. And bonding. Transition to emerging adulthood. Emotional intimacy achieved in the affection phase may be coupled with long-term commitment. Dating has more positive than negative effects on development once a child reaches late adolescence or emerging adulthood. The idea here is that an individual kind of in this phase theory has to initially or first see themselves capable of forming a romantic relationship, and then through time, the type of what's important about a relationship evolves. So from peer status to focusing primarily on your partner, to really this bonding reciprocal relationship that involves high levels of emotional intimacy and or long-term commitment. Finally, adulthood. Social networks. Each of us has a social convoy, social network and support system that accompanies us during our life's journey. Trend toward a smaller social networks with age. Older adults narrow those social networks to close family and friends. Shrinking social networks in late adulthood may be fostered by chronic illness and disability. Life diseases such as death or marriage increases social network sizes. So kind of just in general, social networks decrease, but this also can be heightened or a determinative factor of this decrease being chronic illness or disability. And so if an individual has a disability, being less likely to go out, participate in any physical activities, which could contribute to depression or just feelings of social isolation, and then kind of a deterioration of social relationships over time. But kind of just in general, the trajectory is for smaller social networks with age. But the size of adults' social network is not as important as whether it includes a confidant, a spouse, a relative, or friend to whom the individual feels especially attached. Men are particularly dependent on their spouses. The benefits of having a confidant increase levels of life satisfaction, physical health, cognitive functioning, and longevity. Benefit when having interactions are rewarding rather than stressful. Social support positively impacts the cardiovascular, endocrine, and immune system, and improves the body's ability to cope with stress and contributes to better physical and cognitive functioning. So kind of the idea here is this, as stated before about previous relationships, the quality of the relationship is a key component of these social networks, wherein these confidants act as a protective factor and just as a source of social support and kind of bonding, social friendship, contributing to greater life satisfaction just by talking to them, going out on activities with them, etc. Individuals who do not have that social confidant are at risk for a whole host of negative developmental outcomes. And this can be exacerbated, especially for men, if their wife dies, because men are particularly dependent on their spouses, whereas women in American societies traditionally have a larger social network or a higher quality social network among their peers. But it is interesting to note that, as I've stated in previous lectures, that as kind of group memberships and community participation declines within the United States, what will that do to these kind of social networks, the quality of them, and how will that impact developmental outcomes? What is capable or even exists right now, or what will exist in the future of ways to replace or even recreate those previous social networks within the community, so such as like labor organization, political participation, community engagement, or and we even saw that church attendance falling down, again kind of acting as a source of social support. How that is replaced, or what is replaced with, or if whatever certain unionization or community organization increases, what actually happens along those lines, how that will impact adults' social networks and will consequently impact developmental outcomes. And we don't know what that will look like in the future. So it's kind of an interesting time of turmoil. I wanted to quickly review Sternberg's triangle theory of love. This is a classic theory of love in adults. Sternberg identifies different types of love based on the strength of the three components: passion, intimacy, and commitment. Passion, sexual attraction, romantic feelings and excitement. Intimacy, feelings of warmth, caring, closeness, trust, and respect in a relationship. And commitment involves first deciding that one loves the other person and then committing to a long-term relationship. So the idea here is that you have three components, and you can range in the strength of the three components, and the relative strength of said three components contributes to kind of like classification labels associated with the strength of the three components. So you could be high on commitment, high on intimacy, and low in passion, for example, or high in passion, high in intimacy, and low in commitment, for example. And each of those kind of clusters of strength on those three components are kind of labeled, and there's kind of a pyramid associated with that varying levels of strength on those three components, which you don't need to know, but kind of that's how this works. There's thought to be 4 adult attachment styles. Adult styles of attachment are related to the quality of the romantic relationship, their well-being, physical and mental health in later life. The quality of the parent-child relationship that an adult experienced earlier in life predicts adult attachment style and romantic relationship quality. So kind of the idea here is that there are adult attachment styles, and they're related to developmental outcomes, and they are thought to be associated with previous parent-child attachment styles or relationships. Which is, to the extent that correlation is true, and found across cultures, is thought to provide evidence of the importance of those early parent-child attachments, and not just the developmental outcome, specific developmental outcomes of that child, but also future relationship outcomes, possibly through the child understanding how to form relationships and interacting with their relationships based on, or at least contributed by, those early parent-child relationships. And I wanted to close with one more study about cultural differences and the benefits of happiness in adulthood. There's evidence of cultural differences and the benefits of happiness for white Americans experiencing more positive emotions associated with fewer signs of depression, whereas Asian Americans do not have different risk of depression depending on their experience of positive emotions. So kind of, again, going back to the repercussions of emotions, but here we're talking about adults. And finally, there are also cultural differences in the consequences of experiencing negative emotion. Experiencing negative emotions may not have the same consequence across cultures. A 2010 study, Russians and Americans read vignettes describing subjects who felt upset. The subject in the vignette either does or does not analyze her feelings. There were 2 conditions. Either the subject of the vignette analyzed her feelings, that is, self-reflections, or she did not. The results showed that Russians were more likely than Americans to identify with a self-reflective subject. Moreover, Americans who identified with the self-reflective subject were more depressed than those who did not identify with the self-reflective subject. Russians showed the opposite trend. People who were self-reflective were not more depressed than those who were not. So, kind of hidden, kind of a final takeaway study here is that that the consequences of these experiencing negative emotions vary across cultures. Wherein in this study, kind of the idea of brooding, of being very self-reflective, of kind of like an individual's feelings, kind of just dwelling on feelings in general, kind of thought in the West as being associated with negative outcomes. And in this study did find that those who identified with self-reflective subject were more depressed than those who did not. However, in the Russian group, they did not find this study. And in fact, people who were self-reflective were not more depressed than those who were not self-reflective. So kind of the final takeaway message that the impact of these emotions is this idea of happiness, and really just individualized happiness and how much we should attune to emotions and the intensity of emotions varies culturally. So although we are a social species and these social dynamics matter, the specific social dynamics differ. The specific impacts of attachment differ across culture. So just something to keep in mind. But that's all for this week. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you have a great week. Thanks a lot. Bye.